French speaking, which is interesting for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that Charlotte Whitten, in her really crafty diplomacy to be elected as the Canadian representative, to be chosen in Canada, so that her name would be put forward by Canadian social workers and reformists to be the one person to represent Canada in Geneva on children's things. She argued that she had relationships with the French and the English. So I am your bilingual person, whereas that other person who had actually was more popular from the Social Welfare Council had no relation to French Canada. So the French nature of Canada made her important. The same kind of argument that Raoul Dandurand was making otherwise. But what's also interesting is that she was in her family, half Catholic, half Protestant, and she also made that argument. I'm better than the others because I straddle two worlds. And the French-speaking people in Geneva had their own networks. And Colin, there she appears a lot. When they arrive in Geneva, she lives there. She hosts them in her flat. She is a very important person for French-speaking people and French Catholic the social life of French-speaking people in Geneva. And there is Charlotte Whitten when she visited in the, I think, early 30s for that one. Okay, and let's carry on here. She was also a Catholic, and this is where she's the most André Colin, a magnet. When Georges-Henri Lévesque, who is connected to the International Labour Office and is also a famous French-Canadian Catholic reformist, was really hated by, is very well known for his animosity with Duplessis, and he spent a lot of time in Ottawa, and he was close to the University of Ottawa because they didn't want him in Quebec because he was too much on the social reform part of the Catholic Church. So Georges-Henri Lévesque here, pictured at Université Laval, with the first cohort of the people he trained in political and social sciences there in the spirit of the Catholic reform movement. When he goes to Geneva in the mid-30s, he visits André Colin's salon, and he meets all the Catholics over there. And they get to be quite antagonized by the Anglo-Protestant world, which, like Eric Drummond and like Rachel Crowdy, who was in the picture at the beginning, think that we know better, like Grace Abbott, like all the American social workers who think that they know better. And so that love becomes not only, they're together, but they are also defensive. So in Geneva, they speak about the Latins. They even call them the noodles. And there's a lot of bad blood going on between both. And the topics where they are divided in the case of child welfare are institutionalization. So orphanages are bad. That's the same as the Canadian social work beginning. Orphanages are bad, foster care is good. And that's really where social workers in North America are professionalizing. The rest is the church, and it's not good. And they are trying to break that monopoly. And they organize from Geneva a series of inquiries in the world to see how orphanages and foster care are working. And they are determined to say that foster care is better. But as they do their inquiry, they gather all sorts of interesting stuff on kind of middle-sized institutions, especially in Eastern Europe, who, when you look at them nowadays, where foster care in North America is not seen as the best thing, right? A lot of bad things are happening. The kind of solutions that progressive social workers are proposing now, they're all there in these kind of compendium of what people do in all over the world. But at the end of the report, Whitten is forceful there, uses the Toronto Children Aid Society paperwork, like how do you foster a kid, and it becomes the template for fostering children all over the world, right? She's really the world as Toronto, and fostering recommendations of the League written with Toronto lawyers and orphan and foster care organizations. She was André Collin from Belgium. Belgium had famously had colonies in the Congo. And when child welfare people were writing in the bulletins in Belgium, in the bulletins of social reformists in Belgium, and then in the Save the Children International Union bulletin about the Congo, these pictures were appearing, the very pictures of the lantern slides of the Congo Reform Organization showing children who had been maimed, like adults were maimed by the terrible exploitative rubber companies of the Belgian elite, right? So after the war, Belgium has mandate authorities over Rwanda, and so they continue the kind of relief, over famine relief in this case, that they were doing, the Belgian Red Cross and the Belgian Save the Children and all that they were doing in the war in Belgium, but also that they were doing to some extent in the Congo, because these are pictures taken by missionaries in the Congo who were trying to stop these kind of abuse. The child welfare movement of after the war in favor of children's rights is also, and I'll tell you that later, trying to involve children in more voluntary work. So children should learn to be citizens, and so you have Red Cross Junior societies and Red Cross Junior newspapers, and this one, after the war, 1922, a British one, shows you that all the stereotypes, possible stereotypes about black children are still around, that in this brave new world of universal rights, regardless, and it's written at the beginning of the declaration, regardless of your creed, your color, and your language, it's all still the stereotypes are there. But there are, amongst reformists at the League and at the Save the Children International Union, people who are thinking, okay, now we have a declaration of Universal Declaration of Rights of Children. We have, just after the reconstruction efforts in Eastern Europe and Central Europe are over, what do we do? And they start looking at India and at Africa, and they start producing things like that. A kind of a bit black, a bit white kid, not completely white, but not stereotypical black, universal, and who is standing for all children of the world. So there is all these rights of the child of that time are all to some extent imperialist, but there is other discourses and tropes that are entering slowly the discourse of these reformists at the League and elsewhere. And so there is also the whole settler colonies world where the language of children's rights is expanding. And for Canada, the Social Welfare Journal publishes the declaration like a few weeks after it is enacted. And then there is an ambitious Saskatchewan teacher who she goes around rural Saskatchewan with her declaration, and she writes this extraordinary article in English, which is so good for the Save the Children International Union that they translate it in French and they publish it, and they even, in their own journal, the International Bulletin of Child Protection, and then it's so popular that they actually publish excerpts which they send all over the world to see, look, this lady said, so the impression of a teacher in Alberta, sorry, it's not Saskatchewan, and she says, okay, if we were to follow all these articles, here's what we would do in Alberta. And the picture of Alberta is terrible, right? Alberta looks awful. And so then the people in Geneva, the Canadians in Geneva see that, they're appalled, and so then they write to the British Foreign Office to say, stop them. The British office writes to the Save the Children International Union, which is full of British people, and they withdraw the whole thing. So Canada, in some ways, signs these things as a mark of statehood, like they did, the international documents at the time. All the dominions are signing. India is even signing, but then South Africa, Canada. But then that is a mark of statehood, but when things go wrong, they run to London to try to have London shut up dogs and shut up the Save the Children International Union. Interestingly, as they start opening to African children, they open to Aborigines children in Australia, and they start looking at native children in North America. And they do it in connection with Child Protection Bureau and the South American Bureau of the Protection of the Child, and also with child welfare reformists in the United States. And then it's like the Red Indian, they start publishing about this and saying that there are problems there, and then the institutions are bad, and these people have to be schooled, and the numbers for infant mortality are terrible. So they're stalling, and they use the language of children's rights to try to show that things have to be done in that direction. But it's minimal, but it's bad. And again, if we go back to Colin remains a philanthropist. She is in an international organization, an organization of states, but she thinks and works as a philanthropist. And NGOs at the time, after the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, really in many ways take over the energy again towards more child welfare. They use the League of Nations, but they really have to do a lot of their own work. So one of the things they do when they try to push the discourse about the rights of the child south and in the colonies, and the League and Colin herself support the Save the Children International Union Conference of the Rights of the Child in 1931 in Geneva. So it's supported by the League. They actually hold that conference at the same time as the Mandates Commission meets, so that they can have all these people who are interested in Africa there. But they do a lot of preparation, and they gather tons of statistics about what's going on in Africa. So this is infant mortality by colony, and they have child labor by colony. And when they ask directly Spain, France, and the UK about statistics about their own colonies in Africa, they say, no way, we are not sending you any of that. This is our job, you are not entering our colonies. Then they ask the International Labour Office. The International Labour Office is very interested, so they ask again, no way, we're not sending that to you. So then they ask all the missionaries they know, all the child welfare people they know, everybody in all the NGOs they know, to send some documentation, which they bring to Geneva in a conference of about, I think, 400 people coming from the colonies, including a dozen of people who are Black indigenous people. And I wrote an article about them, I can talk about that later. And they try to start documenting the status of children in Africa. So there you see, like Colin, people whose heart is in philanthropy, seeing the limits of what this League of Nations can do, and by the side trying to pressure the League, or even with the support of the League sometimes, to try to pressure colonial power to do more than they're doing. And one of the most interesting things of this Declaration of the Rights of the Child of 24, and of the movement towards child welfare at the time, and this is my last slide, my one bus slide, the other one is the conclusion, is that Colin was an adult, and all these people are an adult. There are no children at the League. When the United Nations meets to adopt the Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1989, actually to draft it earlier, the only country who brings children is Canada. And it's our Landon Pearson, who has her center at my university, who organizes that. So children don't come, even if at the bottom of the Declaration of 24, it says children have to be brought with a sense of their responsibility towards others and should become political being. They're not there. In 1989, it says children should have a say in the politics that concern them, but they're not there either. But anyway, I want to talk to you about what it means in 1924 to say children should be raised in the knowledge of their future as citizens and should participate in the public life of their country. So at the time of the big mobilization during the war, and this is an advert in newspapers in Toronto, it says crushed by in the middle of international dispute, and then they say, what do children know about politics? Nothing. Why should they suffer from politics? So it's their very ignorance of politics that justifies the fact that there should be international care for them. But then that is not the only picture that prevails. At the same time, a lot of these child welfare workers encouraged the Junior Red Cross, and especially after the war, you know, how do we keep children involved? During the war, a lot of children did a lot of work that women could not do. There were, even in Canada, soldiers that were minor, like under 21 years old, who went fighting. So children had been mobilized in many ways in the war effort. There is a wish to continue that mobilization. So I have this really cool picture here of children and youth collecting money in Ivory Coast for the relief of people in Europe. So it's a South-North charity, unusual one, but interesting. I can come back on that. And I put that picture here of the 30s to show you that many people in West Africa, in Ethiopia, were worried of the hold that fascist movements had on young people. And so they could not ignore the political nature of children's involvement. It was there. And if you let the communists do it, or you let the fascists do it, you were missing on something. So in many ways, they were running after them. And that, when I asked Landon Pearson, the Canadian lady who was the main person for Canada between 79 and 89 to negotiate the Convention of the Rights of the Child, where the political action of kids is much bigger than 24, she said that a lot of it was driven by communists and who really want, you know, the communist youth was very important, and communists in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, and they were trying to run after them to have an idea of political action which was not only the communist idea of political action. So that was really bothering people, the youth involvement in Nazi and fascist and communist movements. And so that really had them do more and more Red Cross kind of stuff. And then I wanted to show you this thing. This is a finding of yesterday. So last Friday, I've got to tell you that because I'm so happy of that. Last Friday, I had my students in my course in the history of youth and children look at old Red Cross children newspapers, Canadian ones. And one group there found this, like, it's 2 full spreads. It's a newspaper that is that big, about Ethiopia. And it's about the solidarity. So one of the things that the Red Cross does, and the Save the Children and all these people who are for children's rights, they do solidarity between children of different countries. You know, I will sympathize with people of my age around the world. And very good studies of Girl Guides and Scouts have shown that to some extent this is working. So some people, especially in the Global South, take that seriously and are raised with the idea that they are equal to the youth in other countries. Anyway, 1970s, the Canadian Red Cross goes and fetch documentation from some Canadians in Ethiopia to write the history of that princess who in the 1930s in Ethiopia and in the 40s after the war was central to the development of child welfare in Ethiopia. I've been working on that lady for years. I could not believe that my students found this. So this is like the history for kids. And so they were like, oh, that's fun. And you can even have a cutout doll of the princess and put some clothes on her. And I was thinking, you have no idea what we found. Anyway, so there you go. This is the potted story of the lady I've been working on for years for the consumption of Canadian kids in the 1970s. More later, because I've just discovered it. And so just to finish, Colin, I know, this is the Advisory Committee on Social Questions. These two are 1938. This is in the New Palace of Nation. You recognize the style. This one, I don't even know the date. I know she's there, but I don't know who she is. Like, I'm there looking at the woman putting big, small, cross-cutting pictures to see there that cannot be Crowley, that could not be this person, but I'm still not sure of who she is, which is very interesting given how prominent she was in the diplomacy of 24, in the Catholic and French diplomacy of the 1930s, and in the general Belgian diplomacy of the League of Nations. Thank you.
So my job is to just facilitate questions. Does anybody want to start us off? Yeah.
I was actually just in Winnipeg the other day and did a tour of the general strike
Yes.
sites. And one of the sites we went to was the Victoria Ironworks. They used a lot of children in their labor, child labor. I'm curious about labor and child labor and how much working children or the protection of children who had to work came up in some of the League of Nations.
Yeah, so very good. So it was really the province of the International Labour Office who did a lot. But they had started before the League, right? This is the League, the International Labour Office precedes the League, and then it becomes part of it. And one of the first things they do is child labor laws and women labor laws and dangerous work for women and all that. And it is, these are international conventions with their limits, and also what is child labor is very industrial and mining. It's not the main sectors of child labor, agriculture and girls in their home, that is not regulated. Like it is, really they follow, it's not an invention, it's the same in Canada or in France. But sometimes, I mean, the International Labour Office is more to the left than the League, and so sometimes they actually catch stuff that the League cannot do. So when the Conference of the African Child, I mean, I'm giving many answers there, but when the Conference of the African Child meets in 31, not organized by the League, but supported by the League, observers of the International Labour Office are there, and they're talking, a fourth of the conference is about labor. And there's a communist who shows up, a black American communist, John Ford, who's running for vice president, really interesting guy, 1930s. He's back from Moscow via Amsterdam, and he's part of the communist labor movement. And he comes to that conference and he says, this is all rubbish. And he's all for economic rights. You cannot have these fancy rights if you don't have economic rights for the adults and for the children. And then he has a lot to say about the inadequacy of that conference, who is still, a fourth of it on child labor. And he is really almost expelled by the conference. The black delegates listen to him, and the ILO delegation. And they welcome him there, and he visits, and he talks about economic rights in general. It's not just the kids, but also about the difficulties that lead to child labor. And you've got one, remember there's one here, about the work of herd boys in, and that was for the conference, right? It was done by a missionary, an American, British missionary who was bothered by these things. So by the side, they are interested, and when they talk about education, they're interested. But education is the intellectual organization. So it's them welfare, it's more indirect. Welfare in institutions, welfare and fostering. Actually, the League and the Home Children, they do something for that in Canada. So the migrations, because that's international, Witten is very important in the early 20s and at the League for that. So the Home Children, because this is migration of children to work and the scandal of that. And so she's instrumental, and she musters support at the League for that. And some stuff with the International Labour Organization, but really they leave them to do that. And yeah, that's how it goes. Yeah.
I have a question. This may be outside of the League of Nations, but I'm interested in what you were talking about the possibility of the children being involved in the writing of the Declaration of Children's Rights. And then it made me wonder if there's any countries where children are more in a model of where children are institutionally involved in governance. Are there countries that come to mind where children are very involved?
So this is a sketchy answer, but I've got two answers to that. It's not comprehensive, it's more like examples. One of them is Sweden, where they are more systematic. So if you do, and I was in Sweden for something else, if you look at the Swedish playground, kids have been involved in designing this. There's no way. It's nothing to do with ours. So, and it's systematically, I mean, not a little. And so there are places by law where they actually took the convention seriously, actually pushed for that part of the convention as well, so that they are involved more systematically in municipal and school design and things like that. So that there is a more systematic wish to really take these articles of the convention seriously. The other one is what Landon Pearson is doing here. So Landon Pearson, she had a huge grant from it's a philanthropy thing, the Muttered Foundation. For 10 years, every fall, she does that conference called Shaking the Movers. So they take one right, so disability last year, and then they like her and her gang invite children from all over the country. They try to ask social workers and education people to come to one place for, I think, a whole big weekend. And then they have all sorts of ways, and some of these kids are not old, and to ask these children, what would you like? And then and who would you like to say it to? And then they actually translate what they said in a report which they send to whoever needs to listen. And that's Shaking the Movers, and then the movers are supposed to answer, and then they make recommendations. And so they did indigenous kids, they did disability, I think they did labor, and that's an extraordinary model. It's got all sorts of problems with it, but it does some remarkable things. Otherwise, I've been seeing a bit of how did they do it in PEI, Landon and I supervise how did they do it in Peru. So they are like scattered ways of doing that, but nothing really systematic. And it's always a problem. I mean, when that convention was enacted in '89, German Greer, the Australian British feminist, wrote, "This is a fallacy." She got a fallacy of children's rights. If you really took children's demands seriously, and she'd been doing a lot of visiting in Northern Africa at that time, for reasons I don't remember, they would say no war, no divorce of our parents, and lots of candy. And she said, there's no way. So she did not even think that it was a good idea. Then there's an indirect level at which that happened. Landon Pearson, that's the one I know best because I don't do recent stuff very much. Landon Pearson in '89, she was senator after. She took the article that said that divorce should happen, the best interest of the child should be always taken seriously in cases of divorce. She ran this huge senatorial inquiry that was 20 years ago to say here's how the divorce law of Canada should be changed for that. And only in June, like 20 years later, these recommendations were accepted. So that's not children, it's not children doing the law, but it's the law making sure that children have a say in these difficult situations, more seriously than, and they quote the Noen, the declaration. Yep.
I really liked the way you talked about the First Before and how that impacted the Belgian movement. And at other points you brought in, and even on the screen now, this idea of the Belgian Congo and information about the extreme abuses. So would you think that maybe knowledge of the extreme abuse going on in the Belgian Congo was a motivator? Like was this news
Scandal.
that was coming about these extreme
Very much so. So the Congo reform movement of the 1900s, the slide, this is what a slide, this was part of a slideshow that you could actually purchase, London slides that you could purchase to, there were like 40 lantern slides, you could purchase your kit and travel with it and all that. These scandals are very important in the history of child welfare in general, and that was particularly graphic. But then the good old humanitarian trouble there and everywhere is after the scandal. What do you do? And how do you keep it going? And that's why the history of the League is interesting, because it's really the whole energy of the war. And there's tons of, people don't quite understand, but it works, right? And it works big time. And it works in a way they didn't think. Save the Children, when they put these ads in the newspaper, there's an immense amount of workers who give a bit of money, way more than they've ever seen. So all of a sudden they realize that the workers' movement and the unions are actually part of it and campaign for it in a way that they've never done before. And they don't understand what's struck them, right? But so the Labour Party becomes very important, and it's Ramsay MacDonald who bring the charter and really leads the General Assembly. So the first